Assalamu alaikum dear students, welcome to the course Principle in Animal Life 2. This is lecture number 43. The topic is species concepts. Discussing agenda for the topic is introduction, the biological species concept, morphological species concept, ecological species concept. Lecture outcome. After watching and listening this lecture, students will be able to define a species under various concepts. Introduction. The word species is Latin for kind or appearance. In biology, we use this term quite often to refer to organisms of a specific kind or appearance. In this lecture, we will define a species under various concepts and we will analyze the benefits or the advantages and the shortcomings of those concepts. In daily life, we commonly distinguish between various kinds of organisms, dogs and cats for instance, based on differences in their appearances. So the most common way to assign objects or living organisms into groups is their phenotype, their physical appearance. But are organisms truly divided into the discrete units we call species? So can we differentiate and classify individuals into separate categories, into separate identical units? Is it possible? To answer this question, biologists compare not only the morphology of different groups of organisms, but also less obvious differences in physiology, biochemistry, and DNA sequences. As already mentioned, that the predominant criteria for classification is phenotype, physical appearance, physical outlook, and it was Carolus Linnaeus, the father of taxonomy, who classified organisms, and the criteria or the parameter he used was their physical outlook, their phenotype, their physical appearance. But he carried out his classification back in 1700s, and since then so much advancement has taken place into that body of knowledge. New techniques have been developed which help us study even the minor details of the cell or the nucleus. We are able to study different biological macromolecules. We are able to study different types of pathways. We are able to analyze the nucleotide sequence in DNA. So these new parameters that are added to the science courtesy of development in technology are nowadays also used as criteria, as parameters for classification. The results generally confirm that morphologically distinct species are indeed discrete groups differing in many ways beside their body forms. So because of the advancements in technology and the development of new techniques, more and more ways are being opened for studying the various aspects of living organisms, and then they can be used as criteria for classification. So nowadays it is not just about the physical appearance or the physical outlook of an organism, but also other features which are used as a criteria for classification. So courtesy of those parameters, we are in a position to assign specific groups to individuals. So species is indeed a discrete, a separate, a distinct unit. Now we will discuss different species concepts, and the first one is biological species concept. This is the most favorite definition of zoologists and biologists. It was developed by a famous taxonomist, ornithologist, and evolutionary biologist, Ernest Mayr, in 1942. The biological species concept emphasizes reproductive isolation. What is reproductive isolation? That the members of a particular species can interbreed with each other, and they cannot breed with members of other species because of certain barriers which may be pre-zygotic or post-zygotic. We have a separate lecture for that topic in which we will discuss the different ways where reproductive isolation is ensured, where a species is unable to mate with members of other species and produce viable offsprings. So this concept says that a species is a group of populations whose members have the potential to interbreed in nature and produce viable, fertile offsprings, but do not produce viable, fertile offsprings with members of other such groups. So a group of 20 or 25 individuals is living in a particular area, and we call it as a population. So can we call the members of that population as belonging to a single species, or they may be belonging to several species? So what is the basic criteria, the basic principle the biological species concept puts up? It is the breeding and production of fertile offsprings. If two individuals are able to breed with each other, and this breeding results in the production of an individual, and that individual itself can grow up, reaches maturity, and then reproduces on its own, then we can call those two individuals as belonging to the same species. I repeat it again. Two individuals will belong to a same species if they are able to interbreed and produce fertile offsprings. If they are unable to do so, then we will not recognize them as a single species. For example, sometimes the horse and the donkeys, they do try to mate with each other, and the result is a mule which is sterile. So therefore we cannot put horse and donkey into the same species, because although they meet with each other, they mate and they produce an offspring as a result, but that offspring itself is sterile. So this is the prerequisite condition. The two individuals should breed, they should produce a fertile offspring. Fertile means that the offspring which is born must be in a position to reproduce once it reaches the age of maturity. Thus, the members of a biological species are united by being reproductively compatible, at least potentially. So we will classify individuals into the same species if they can interbreed and reproduce fertile offsprings, or at least if they have a potential to interbreed. Now if you ask a question that a person is living in Pakistan and someone else is living in the other corner of the world, now obviously these two individuals cannot mate with each other. So can we classify them into two different species? No, because if they combine, if they come close, then they can perform the act of mating and producing fertile offspring. So they have a potential. On the other hand, humans and chimpanzees, they are distinct biological species, even if they are living anywhere, closer or farther apart, because many factors keep them from interbreeding and producing fertile offsprings. All human beings, for example, belong to the same species. What holds the gene pool of a species together, causing its members to resemble each other more than they resemble members of the other population? Why the members of a species resemble each other more than members of other species? Which criteria ensures the integrity of the gene pool? Why so drastic differences does not arises between members of the same species? It is because the evolutionary mechanism of gene flow, the transfer of alleles between populations. So two populations are living in different areas and they still belonging to the same species, because from time to time they gets this opportunity of coming closer to each other and performing the ritual of mating, and as a result, although they live at different areas, but because of this regular exchange of genes, the differences between them does not arises. Typically, gene flow occurs between different populations of a species. This ongoing exchange of alleles tends to hold the populations together genetically. So if the two populations, this is one population, and here is another population, they are living at different areas, but because of gene flow, because of migration, at times some of the members from that population migrate here, and some members from that population migrates here, and then these incoming members breed with the natives of the area. Therefore, the genetic makeup of the two populations remain nearly similar to each other, and they does not develop differences with each other. Suppose if there is a physical barrier which prevents this intermixing of individuals, then with the passage of time the two populations will develop differences, and eventually it will evolve into different populations. We will discuss speciation, where we will study allotropic speciation, allopatric speciation, which occurs at two different areas where the two populations becomes geographically isolated from each other, and there is no gene flow between them, and as a result both the populations evolve into different species. But it is not going to happen if there is a way of migration and intermixing of individuals of the two populations with one another. But as we will explore in this chapter, a reduction of lack of gene flow can play role in the formation of new species. In the subsequent lectures, we will discuss speciation. There we will discuss allopatric and sympatric speciation, and then you will be able to know what is the significance of the migration between two populations and what happens once the migration is stopped because of some physical barriers. Now, the biological species concept is based on the potential to interbreed, not on physical similarities. Now, you can see the group of individuals, they are differing in their phenotypic traits. Look at the eye structure and the hair structure and the skin color that is differing between the members of that particular group, but they are still categorized as belonging to the same species because of the ability to interbreed and produce fertile offsprings. Now here in the beginning we discussed that nowadays only the similarity in the phenotype is not regarded as a criteria for classification. There are several other features which are considered. So here is an example. These are two different species and they have similarities in their phenotype, but they have differences in their behaviors and therefore they cannot breed with one another and produce fertile offsprings. There is a reproductive barrier that exists. There is a reproductive isolation that exists which prevents the mating of those two individuals and the production of fertile offsprings. So the main focus of biological species concept is reproductive isolation. Now, what are the shortcomings or the limitations of the biological species concept? I repeat this concept once more, how we define a species through this concept. It says that the members of a species can interbreed and produce fertile, viable offsprings. So, a taxonomist who is a follower of biological species concept will recognize two individuals only as a single species if he is 100% sure that those two individuals can interbreed and produce fertile offsprings. If this criteria cannot be fulfilled in one way or the other, then an advocate of this concept will not recognize them as members of the same species. So now we will discuss the limitations of this concept. One strength of the biological species concept is that it directs our attention to a way by which speciation can occur by the evolution of reproductive isolation. So if two populations are reproductively isolated from each other, they are unable to mate with each other, then with the passage of time they will develop differences and eventually evolve into two different species. However, the number of species to which this concept can be usefully applied is limited. Now, here the prerequisite conditions is interbreeding and production of fertile offsprings. So, this concept can only define a sexually reproducing population. What about those organisms which reproduce asexually? They cannot interbreed with each other. So whether you can classify them into a species or not, because this criteria of interbreeding cannot be assessed there, because they are asexually reproducing individuals. And secondly, what about the fossils? You may have listened to news reports on television or elsewhere in books where the evolutionary biologists and paleontologists from time to time report the fossils and then they classify them as a species. So whether an advocate of biological species concept will agree with them, because the criteria of interbreeding cannot be assessed in fossils. Fossils are just the reminiscence of the prehistoric organisms. So how can you classify them into species? Whether you have checked the criteria of interbreeding and production of fertile offsprings? No. So fossils cannot be classified and designated into species on the basis of this concept. And sometimes it is also possible that two different species mate with each other and they reproduces a fertile offspring. For example, these two are different species and they can interbreed and produce fertile offsprings. So whether we will designate them as belonging to same species because they fulfill the definition of this concept. They can interbreed and produce fertile offsprings. So here is another limitation of this concept. Furthermore, in the biological species concept, members are designated by the absence of gene flow, means the two individuals will be recognized as belonging to different species if there is no gene flow between them, no interbreeding between them and production of fertile offsprings. But what about this example? Two different species, they can interbreed. But there are many pairs of species that are morphologically and ecologically distinct. Morphologically means they are phenotypically different, their physical appearance is different, they live in different habitats, their feeding habits are different from each other, but still they can mate with each other. So this, although this is the most favorite definition of the biologists and zoologists, but because of its certain shortcomings, limitations, so we will discuss some other definitions of species. Now, while the biological species concept emphasizes the separateness of different species due to reproductive barriers, several other definitions emphasize the unity within a species. So reproductive isolation is here the predominant criteria, that the members of different species cannot interbreed with each other and produce fertile offsprings. But here another criteria is that groups of individuals belonging to different species can live with each other in a particular area and still maintain their integrity as a different species. Number one is The example is morphological species concept. This species concept was initially introduced by the father of taxonomy, the man responsible for the development of binomial nomenclature, Carolus von Linnaeus. He classified the organisms on the basis of similarities and differences in their phenotype. Organisms having similar phenotypes were placed together, and those having similar phenotypes, dissimilar phenotypes were placed into other groups. So body shape and structural features. And the advantage of using this concept to define a species that it does not take into consideration the criteria of interbreeding, only the physical features, the physical similarities and differences. So you can classify asexual and sexual organisms. You can define those organisms and designate them into different species on the basis of this definition. A disadvantage of this approach, however, is that it relies on subjective criteria. Research may disagree on which structural features distinguish a species. So at times a situation occurs where two individuals have same phenotype, same physical features, yet they belong to different species. And in other cases, two individuals that are phenotypically different from each other belong to the same species. Now here you can see the example. These two frogs belong to same species, but they are phenotypically different. So what the advocate of this concept is going to do in that situation, whether he will classify them into the same species or different species, probably different species because they are morphologically different. Now here, these two frogs, they are different species and they show remarkable similarities with one another. So these are certain things which can prove to be confusing for the followers of this particular school of thought. So we will move on to another species concept, which is ecological species concept. This species concept was presented or developed or described by American evolutionary biologist Lee von Wellen in 1976. Now, how we define a species through this concept? A species is defined in terms of its ecological niche, the sum of how members of the species interact with the non-living and living parts of their environment. Now here, interbreeding is not taken into consideration. The physical similarities and differences are not taken into account. What is the criteria? The criteria is the role played by a species in its environment, how that species interacts with the biotic and abiotic factors, how it fits into the food chain and food web. So these criteria are used. Ecology of the species is studied, ecology of the members of the population are studied, and if there are similarities in their ecology, in their feeding habits, and the way of reproduction and other behaviors, then they are classified into same species. For example, two species of oak trees might differ in their size or in their ability to tolerate dry conditions, yet still occasionally interbreed. So here you can see that they are comparing this concept with biological species concept, that although two species of oak trees may have a different interaction with biological and with biotic and abiotic factors, but they can interbreed. So an advocate of biological species concept will consider this criteria and group them into same species, whereas an advocate of ecological species concept will consider them as distinct species because of having different features and different responses towards the ecological conditions. Because they occupy different ecological niches, these oaks would be considered separate species even though they are connected by some gene flow, even though they are able to interbreed and reproduce. So they are still classified as different species because this criteria is different for them. Unlike the biological species concept, the ecological species concept can accommodate asexual as well as sexual species. So on the basis of this concept, we can classify the sexually reproducing and asexually reproducing organisms into species because the interbreeding criteria is not there. In addition to those discussed here, more than 20 other species definitions have been proposed. Let me share with you one fact, that there are more than 20 different definitions of a species, and no one of them is universally acceptable. None of them is universally acceptable. It is because of this rich diversity of life on earth that it is just impossible to devise a definition of 2 or 3 lines which can represent each and every species living on the planet Earth. So therefore the taxonomists they rely on different definitions depending upon conditions. So different definitions apply at specific areas. This was the end of the lecture. Thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.